Hi, I'm David Haynes. I'm the opinions editor at the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. Welcome to OnPolitics. Today we're going to be joined by Craig Gilbert. Craig is our Washington bureau chief, and he's traveling in Iowa to cover the Iowa caucuses. He's in Des Moines tonight to cover the GOP debate. That'll be a debate without, by the way, Donald Trump. I'm also joined in studio today by Daniel Bice, a columnist for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, and from Madison by Christian Schneider, an editorial page columnist for the Journal Sentinel. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. Sure. First, let's turn to what we can expect to talk about today. It's Iowa caucuses all the time. We'll also talk about the increasingly heated race between Russ Feingold, the former senator, and the sitting senator, the Republican, Ron Johnson. And then we'll take your reader questions. But first, let's go to a recorded interview that I did earlier today. All right, now we turn to Craig Gilbert, the Journal Sentinel's Washington bureau correspondent. Craig's in Des Moines. And Craig, you're at a high school there watching Bernie Sanders, but I'd like to first turn to the Republican side. Where's Donald Trump? He apparently is not coming to the debate tonight. What's going on with that?
He's not. I was at that press conference where he kind of let it slip in a very coy way that he wasn't going to the debate. It's been a long, strange ride with Donald Trump, and it just got a little stranger. He sort of blew up the debate in a way. I mean, there's going to be competing, dueling events, his event and the Republican field without him. It's a big gamble, and there's a lot of discussion about how much of this is tactical and strategic and how much of it is just him digging in and playing out this feud with Fox News. And, you know, what's at risk for him? I mean, he came in here with some momentum. If it backfires on him, it'll be remembered as kind of an unforced error. If it doesn't, it'll be another case where Donald Trump is sort of playing by his own rules and getting away with it.
Yeah. So do you think this Megyn Kelly flap is real, or is it all part of the game where they essentially are sort of playing each other?
I think the feud with Fox News is real. I think he was, he was pissed off about the first debate. He was angered by this kind of snarky press release that Fox News put out in the middle of all this. Right. There's egos at stake here, certainly, and he doesn't want to play by their rules. And I think, his opponents, I was at a Ted Cruz rally last night. He's trying to exploit this. He's trying to make the most of the fact that Donald Trump is not going to be there for Iowa voters just before the caucuses. We'll see. Obviously, for the hardcore of Trump supporters, that may not matter. But I've talked to a lot of people at these events that are actually undecided, and they're undecided about Donald Trump. They have mixed feelings about him. They like his brashness, but they also think he goes too far. So for those people that are kind of sitting on the fence about him, this could be a big deal.
Isn't it still a way for him to keep his name out there in front of the media and, like you said, blow up the debate? I wonder if the calculation here is that helps him more than it would help him to go to the debate and actually face questions.
I guess so. It just seems like a big gamble to me. Yeah. And it's not like he's not at the center of attention anyway. He would have been the center of attention at the debate, right. I think, in many ways. I mean, there were some risks in. He would also have been a target at the debate, but he's been a target before. So I don't think he's had to worry about maintaining a certain level of media attention. I could be wrong. It still seems a little bizarre to me that we're talking about this.
So there's a new Wall Street Journal poll out this morning that showed Trump was boosting his lead in all three of the early states: Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina. And they also had a story this morning in which Cruz supporters, you may have heard this when you were at the Cruz event, Cruz supporters are essentially saying Cruz has to win Iowa or he may not be able to stop Trump. How much of that is politics and how much of that is real?
Well, they're reaching for every argument they can get, and one of their messages to different Republican and different conservative audiences is that if Donald Trump runs the table in these early primaries, he may be unstoppable. And so that's one of his arguments. It's not a bad argument. And And if Donald Trump does run the table in these early states, I mean, you will see more of a concerted effort by some people in the conservative movement, maybe some people in the party establishment, to try to get behind one candidate to stop him. But whether it's too little or too late, we don't know.
Well, I guess that's the other question. I talked to Charlie Black today, who I'm sure you know, who helped run McCain's campaign in 2008. And he was saying in every other cycle, you've ended up with a moderate candidate who emerged to challenge the outsiders. And he says, I wouldn't bet against that happening again. But at this point, aren't the moderate candidates, the establishment candidates, at least in these first couple of primary states, splitting up the vote?
They are, and that's why the next state, New Hampshire, is going to be very important, because it's a state where that population of moderate Republican voters is bigger, and people are going to be looking for one candidate from that wing of the party to emerge and kind of consolidate that support. And whether that happens or not, it's, is it going to be Marco Rubio? Is it going to be John Kasich? Is it going to be Jeb Bush? Is it going to be Chris Christie? But, looking back, we had a candidate, Scott Walker, who a lot of people thought might fill that slot in the party. And looking back now from the vantage point of a few months after his withdrawal, you can see how his failure of his candidacy was really kind of emblematic of the struggles of the kind of establishment wing of the party against these outsiders, and also the inability of any one candidate to consolidate the establishment wing of the party.
Well, let's talk for a bit about the Democratic side. You're at a Bernie Sanders rally at a high school in Des Moines. Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton both yesterday came out strongly in attacking this tax deal that Johnson Controls is seeking with Tyco. Talk a bit about that and the politics behind it.
Yeah, it's part of a larger theme with the Democrats of kind of running against Wall Street, running against corporate America, running against, particularly in Bernie Sanders' case, corporate money in politics. I was at a Hillary event where she, unprompted, brought up the Johnson Controls merger. Both candidates had reacted to it on Monday when it happened, but this was sort of an extended discussion, extended attack. And it was interesting because Donald Trump brought up the Tyco Johnson Controls issue at an event a day earlier that I was at, but Donald Trump sort of had a different takeaway from it. His takeaway was that our politicians are incompetent, and I will prevent this kind of thing from happening. The takeaway for Democrats is just sort of corporate misbehavior and malfeasance, and the need for policy reform. So those are two very different messages hearing. But these two Democratic candidates are locked in a very tight race, and just like there's a tight race on the Republican side, and it's going to have a lot to do with the composition of the turnout in the Iowa caucuses, which we've heard a lot about, but how many first-time new caucus-going participants are there going to be? How many young voters are going to turn out? Obviously, Bernie Sanders, the more people like that, the better it is for Bernie Sanders.
Hey, Craig, one final question before we let you get back to your event there. I compare the crowds. You've seen 4 or 5 candidates already in the short time you've been there. What are the crowds like for these candidates?
Well, Donald Trump got a huge crowd at the event I was at. I mean, beyond anything anybody else has gotten where I've seen them. Some of it depends on the size of the venue. This is Bernie Sanders is speaking at a school. It's a crowd of students, so it's not a crowd that his campaign built. Bernie Sanders is an interesting candidate because he doesn't generate a lot of personal passion at these events, but his message, I think, does resonate with a lot of Democratic voters. I think Hillary Clinton is not an elector candidate either because she's a familiar face. The Ted Cruz event I was at, there was a lot of passion. It was sort of a pro-life themed event, and so there's a lot of passion from those kind of ardent conservatives and social conservatives for Ted Cruz. But you do find people at these events that are truly undecided, and even occasionally some people that can't even decide which party they want to caucus in. So there's that wild card factor here at the end. Something always breaks at the end of the Iowa caucuses, and we'll have to wait and see what that is.
All right. Well, we'll be watching and reading your reports. Craig Gilbert from Des Moines, thanks for joining us.
Great.
So now I'm back with Dan Bice, one of our columnists at the Journal Sentinel. But first I want to go to Madison and Chris Snyder. Christian, you're headed down to Iowa tomorrow. And you're going to be doing some blogging and some social media for us, and then write a column for Monday. You have to get your column done for Sunday first, I understand, as your editor. So, but we'll look forward to that. I wonder if you could pick up on something that Craig just talked about, and that is Governor Walker's candidacy, which may have been the first victim of this outsider insurgency in the party. What do you make of that, looking back on it now with the perspective of a couple of months?
Yeah, I think Rick Perry was probably the first, but Walker definitely is in that mix. It's funny, before the campaign when we all sit together and try to figure out, okay, who are the plausible candidates, who's going to win. We sit down, position on this, and here's their position on that. And Walker's really good on taxes. He's really good on the union stuff, and it all just goes out the window. I mean, none of us really knows anything. Because it doesn't come down to positions on certain things. It's, it's just essentially just anger over, kind of the state of America and where we need to be. So yeah, I mean, he was definitely one of the first casualties, and he was one of the guys that had, real accomplishments, and now that almost seems to be a detriment in this race.
Right, that makes you part of the elite. Dan, what's your take on that?
I think we're all still trying to get a handle on who are these Trump supporters. A Christian wrote about that this week, raising the question of whether they were traditional Republicans or not. And each of these polls that come out there are assumptions built in as to what sort of turnout there'll be in Iowa. And I think in 2012 is 122,000 Republicans who came out, and these polls are assuming 150, 170, maybe even 200,000 people. And if it's that, Trump wins big. But if it's again like 122, 125,000, then it would be a very close race between him and Cruz.
Right. And it's interesting, when I was out there last week, I talked to the county chairman in Sioux County, which is one of the most Republican counties in the country, something like 90% Republican. And I said, so what do you make of this Trump phenomenon? Do you think they'll turn out for the caucuses? And he reminded me, I was at this event, that people stood in line for 3 hours in sub 3-degree wind chills to see Donald Trump. And I'm writing about this in the Sunday paper. He said, if they're willing to do that, I think they can handle a caucus.
But, it is, Trump places a lot of weight into the turnout for his events, but it makes me wonder if this is like counting yard signs to see who's going to win in a race. Just because a certain number of people are going to turn out for that. I mean, you're talking about tens of thousands of people that he's counting on to come out for him. And
a caucus is way different than just showing up to vote. Hey, Chris, again, when I was out there, I heard a tremendous amount of voter anger on the GOP side. I heard people blaming Paul Ryan for being part of the problem because he cut a budget deal recently. Right. And they're not happy with that. To what extent have Republicans created their own problem here by overpromising?
Yeah, I think there's some of that. I think what you've had in the Republican Party over the last few years, Republicans have only won the popular vote in the presidential election once in the last 6 times, I think. So as you've had kind of the popular vote diminishing, you had certain people within the Republican Party do very well for themselves. Your Rush Limbaughs, your Ann Coulters, your people that come out and try and gin up part of the base against the rest of the Republican Party. So while the politics of the last few years has been good for some people, it's almost been to the detriment of the party as a whole.
There is the issue that you and I have talked about, and that's does Iowa even matter?
Right. It's a really good question.
What you see who's won in the recent years was Santorum, Huckabee, and they didn't go much further after that. And it's been a while. I mean, Barack Obama won last time, but George W. Bush was the last Republican candidate to win and eventually get the nomination.
Yeah,
I was actually picked the eventual president, I think, once out of the last 7 GOP primaries. So a Republican has only carried Iowa, the state of Iowa, in the general election once in the last 30 years. They've got us beat by 1. So and that was George Bush in 2004, I think. So,
but I would say that this might be a little bit different, because people like Christian and me have been saying for a long time that Trump was going to fade. But if he's able to win this, it'll give some substance to his campaign, I believe.
Well, there's no doubt, and there's also still this circular firing squad among the three establishment candidates, right. Rubio, Kasich, and Bush. Bush is still running pretty tough ads in Iowa against Rubio. And so they haven't been able to coalesce, and it seems to me the longer it takes for that to happen, the more of a chance that a guy like Cruz or Trump might have to be a real candidate. And let's move to the Democratic side for just a minute. The Democrats, as Craig talked about, are using the Johnson controls tax inversion deal to their benefit here. Chris, first to you. What do you make of that politically?
Well, I mean, I think it's populist politics. It's going after big business, which is never going to hurt you in a Democratic primary. And so I mean, Hillary Clinton's going to use it as much as she can. I mean, she's going up against Bernie Sanders, who you're never going to out badmouth big business Bernie Sanders, if that makes any sense. But this kind of gives her a little wedge in there, and she jumped on it right away, and I think she's gonna use it as much as she can.
So let's move now to the Feingold Johnson race. Russ Feingold and Ron Johnson had a fairly tight race 6 years ago. The two of them will face each other again in November. And that race is already heating up, Dan.
Which is a huge difference from last time, because Ron Johnson got into the race in May of 2010.
I'd forgotten about that. You're right.
And so the race was very short. Now this time, Russ Feingold got into the race in May, but that was a year ago in May in 2015. Mm-hmm. So there's been a lot of back and forth, a lot of money. Millions are already being spent on this race. And I wrote a piece this week about this. And I was interested in the issue of Ron Johnson, where when he was elected, he came in focused almost exclusively on one issue, and that was the national debt. I don't know, do you remember? I mean, that was about the only subject you could get him to talk about.
I do remember that.
But since the election started, and recently in the last couple of months, he's been focused on national security, saying that that's the key issue in the race. Mm-hmm. So I went back and looked at his attendance record as a member of the Homeland Security Committee. And what I found was in his first 4 years in office, he missed about 60% of the meetings on border security, 9/11, homegrown terrorism, those sorts of things. And the campaign pushed back and pointed out that since he became chairman of that committee last year, he's made it to 94% of the committee meetings, which you would hope the chairman would do that. Mm-hmm. But more substantively, they responded by saying, look at Russ Feingold and his numbers when he was a member of the Foreign Relations Committee. And in that case, he missed about half of the hearings. And if you throw in the work sessions, he made it to about 58, 59% of the meetings overall. So in the end, you end up with criticism of Ron Johnson for his first 4 years on Homeland Security, and then criticism of Feingold for his from 2005 to 2010 as a member of the Foreign Relations Committee.
So it's interesting. This is sort of classic politics. You have a story, and one side says, well, the other guy's no better. He does the same thing. So what's the big deal? And you did have somebody in the story, I think it was interesting. It said, well, the fact of the matter is no one goes to all these meetings because you can't. There's not enough hours in a day. But I thought what was interesting, we were talking about this earlier, is the reaction that you got to the story. Talk a little bit about that.
The reaction from the campaigns?
Yes,
yeah,
from the campaigns.
It was neither camp was happy with in particular the headlines on the story.
It's always the headline.
But also I think the Feingold people are saying that there's a false equivalency between the two because they're not making foreign policy the key issue, whereas Ron Johnson's making Homeland Security a key issue. The Johnson people weren't happy that I didn't write the story saying that they both had been absent a good deal of the time from their committee meetings and to made it a hit on both candidates. I mean, I did, in a sense. I included all of the criticism. And in fact, there was much more devoted to Feingold's voting pattern, his attendance record in the piece that I wrote. But yeah, it was just pretty amazing how both sides were not happy with that.
You were like getting text messages or phone calls like
Yeah,
2 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah,
right?
people on both sides were very unhappy about it.
Yeah.
Not the usual text you get at 2 in the morning?
Not the usual text I get at 2
All right,
in the
we're not
morning.
going to go there. So, Chris, what do you make of this? If the campaign this early, and I guess it's not that early, but it seems early to me, if this campaign is this vociferous, what can we expect to see the rest of the way here?
Yeah, I mean, this might be a case for Ron Johnson of maybe losing the battle, but eventually like coming out ahead in the war, because it makes it look bad that he wasn't at this thing, and he people on his behalf are running this attack on Russ Feingold for the Toma VA, trying to make it sound like Russ Feingold was like Stringer Bell in there, like handing out drugs to all these people. But I think in the grander scheme, what it does is it reminds people that Russ Feingold was a senator. He actually was in the Senate for 18 years, and he was there for a long time. And that's ultimately, kind of, they want to remind people of that fact. When Feingold came out and said that, call me Russ, don't call me Senator, there's a reason for that.
He doesn't remember that.
There is also another difference that comes out as a result of the story, and that was that in his 18 years in the Senate, he was never chairman of anything, whereas or chairman of any major committee or even a minor committee, whereas Ron Johnson has had this committee, and he has pushed through some legislation as a result of it.
Well,
but what does it mean? I mean, actually, I wrote in an earlier piece on the Feingold campaign about Progressives United, a group that he helped set up, and how they spent their money and so forth. And again, I'm still hearing 7 months after that piece about it, their anger with certain things. And I think it's because this race is such a high-stakes thing, it's so important in determining who controls the Senate. A lot of money is going to be spent on this, and there's a lot of concern about the headlines in our stories, because third-party groups are going to take those headlines, turn them into ads, and so they want to. So everybody's very conscious of what's going on with this race.
I'm glad you brought up that context too, because it is important. The Democrats feel they have a shot at taking back the Senate. And this race is different because the last time Senator Johnson and Feingold faced off, it was a different electorate. It was an off-year electorate, and our electorates in presidential years, as is the case in many states, tend to be more Democratic. So they feel better about this one for that reason alone.
And Bill Glauber wrote a piece just recently about how in that election, when on election day, both candidates were viewed more positively than negatively by the campaigns. Mm-hmm. That's not going to be the case here, just because tens of millions of dollars are going to be spent over the next 11 months pounding both candidates.
So if you love politics, you're going to love the next few months. And if you don't, I think you need TiVo. So let's move to some reader questions. I'd like to start with one for you, Chris. And this is about Senator Feingold. At the Marquette Forum, the On the Issues with Mike Goucher recently, Senator Feingold talked about the need to be constructive and bipartisan. And he went on to say that 90% of the provisions in the Patriot Act were good, but he stands by his lone vote of dissent. The viewer says this seems inconsistent to me. If 90% is something good, if 90% of something is good and 99% of your colleagues agree, so where's the compromise?
This may shock people, but I don't know if you can necessarily hold that against Feingold as an example of not being bipartisan. I mean, he was anti-Democrats and Republicans in that case. Obviously, he talks about that vote all the time as being, he foments the idea that he was a maverick and he was voting against everybody at the time. And I mean, we talked about some of the issues that might be in this race. You can always tell a candidate, where they think their weakness is. And he clearly thinks that vote might now be a weakness, which is why he's coming out and talking about, proactively talking about all the things that he wants to do to fight terrorism and all that stuff. So he knows he's going to get hit on that. And so I think you'll see a lot more of that in the months to come.
But I think he also realizes that Wisconsin likes mavericks, people who don't follow the path.
They did for 2 decades, with him.
Right, and so he's trying to fit into that pattern. At the same time, he is a Democrat, and he votes like most Democrats do. There are the exceptions, but he's going to play up these instances in which he didn't vote along with everybody else. Just like this week, he was playing up his donation that he received from Chuck Hagel to try to combat the notions that he's not strong on foreign policy.
Yeah. Interesting. So, Dan, here's one for you. We talked about this briefly, but let's go back to it. Clinton and Sanders complain about tax inversions. This is the Johnson controls deal with Tyco. but they know their tax code, our tax code, created the situation that corporations are avoiding. I think the viewer here is talking about the U.S. having a rather high corporate tax rate. More regulation compared to other countries. That's right. More regulation will just cause corporations to move their headquarters, fix the problem, not the solution. So what's your reaction?
Well, I don't think, again, as Christian said, this is fodder for the campaign trail.
This is not a policy discussion.
No, it's not a policy discussion. So, I mean,
maybe have one, but it's not a policy discussion.
Maybe, I mean, the problem is you can't control the tax rates in other countries. The only thing you could do is move the tax rate down in here, and I don't see Bernie Sanders nor Hillary Clinton suggesting that we do that.
One final question. This one I'm going to throw to you, Christian. I would like someone, Christian Schneider, I'm deputizing you to do this. I would like someone to please explain to me why the party of lower taxes, that's the GOP, does not want to lower interest rates on student debt. Wouldn't Grover Norquist call this a failure to vote to lower the tax on students, a violation of his pledge? Seems counterintuitive, the viewer says. What do you think about that?
Interesting you should say that. I'm happy you asked that question, commenter. I just wrote about this. When you see student loan, first of all, if you refinance these rates, then somebody eventually pays. I mean, people are paying in less, and it changes the system a little bit. But when you do something like that, first of all, you create a moral hazard that people. Obama has set up like some kind of cap where if you're over that cap, you don't have to pay, and so you have people taking out loans that they can't necessarily afford. But what they have found is that the more debt you have, really, actually, the more you're able to pay it. The people who have the high debt are the ones that go to medical school or law school. So the people who have the highest debt really have the most ability to pay it off when they graduate. So there are certainly things that can be done with regard to student debt. But I think keeping tuition down is one of those things that's most important.
I think it's clear that this is a problem. Most people acknowledge it's a problem, but people are still trying to find a solution to it. I mean, I'm going to have 3 kids come out of school. You probably will too.
I've got one that has student debt right now.
Right, and I'll have 3 with student debt in just a couple of years. So,
yeah. Well, let's end it there. I'd like to remind all our viewers that you can read Craig Gilbert's pieces in the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel and, of course, at JS Online. Christian Schneider is headed down to Iowa tomorrow. You can read his work on his blog at JS Online and then a column in the Monday paper. And I'm reporting in the Sunday Crossroads section on voter anger in Iowa that I found when I was down there last week. Thanks for joining us. For Craig Gilbert, Christian Schneider, and Dan Bice, I'm Dave Haynes. I'm the opinions editor at the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel.